And welcome back to GB News Live with some breaking news coming in. At least this is a claim from Russian news agencies who are quoting the Kremlin. The Russian government saying they foiled a drone attack by Ukraine on the Kremlin. They're basically saying it's a failed assassination attempt on Vladimir Putin. Details still coming in, but let's get more with our defence security editor, Mark White, who's back with us in the studio. As we say, no official confirmation. Russian news agencies are reporting a Kremlin claim.
Yeah, and there is social media footage. You should always be careful with that out there that seems to show plumes of smoke coming from that area around the Kremlin. But, you know, regardless of what Kiev might say in terms of whether this is true or not, the very fact that you've got the Russian government making such a serious allegation is a serious escalation, because we don't know what they might do in response to this. But just in the last few minutes, we've had this statement from the Kremlin. They say that on Wednesday night, the Kiev regime made an attempt to strike using UAV, the Kremlin resident, using a UAV, the Kremlin residence of Russian President Vladimir Putin. It said 2 unmanned aerial vehicles were aimed at the Kremlin, and goes on to say, as a result of timely actions taken by the military and special services, with the use of radar warfare systems, the vehicles were disabled. Now, what we don't know, Mark, is if these were drones that were shot down. Of course, we don't know as yet because we haven't heard anything from the Ukrainian authorities. But we also don't know if these drones contained explosives. What we do know, of course, is that drones have been used by both sides in this war, and they have been specially adapted not just to be used for surveillance duties, but actually to carry explosives to, you know, quite deadly effect at times. So it's certainly within the sort of technological know-how of the Ukrainian government to be using drones like this, but we wait to hear what they say, and we wait for a bit more tangible evidence from the Russian authorities about these drones.
And whether they can provide some evidence in terms of what they
whether
shot
they were
down.
carrying
I mean,
explosives.
there is footage online of the Ukrainians building these homemade doodle bugs, so similar to the World War II V1 rockets. I think we've got some pictures of what they're doing in back gardens with bits of pipes and so on. But what we're probably talking about here, they've been buying these Turkish drones, haven't they, and then adapting it. The question has been whether they've had the range literally to fly them far enough to hit the Russian capital. Yeah,
well, in terms of that, no, they wouldn't, obviously. You have to be pretty much in line of sight when using these drones. But just as there are Russian operatives in Ukraine, there are certainly Ukrainian operatives, intelligence personnel, others aligned to the Ukrainian government in Russia and around Moscow. So they would absolutely have the wherewithal to do this, whether they've taken what would be a very drastic step, because although in the early days of the war...
Let's just listen. I mean, we were describing these are these homemade missiles, which
modern-day
doodlebugs, which they are probably going to try and launch in groups of 20. They're not guided in any way by any kind of systems. They literally just fire them off. I think they're calling them Trembetas, a petrol-powered motor thrusting it some 87 miles from launch. Double the range, therefore, of the US-supplied HIMARS rockets. So clearly they're looking at what they can launch for maybe nuisance factor. But, I mean, the Russians saying this is an assassination attempt. Well, it may at least just be a reminder to the Russians, look, you know, he's not untouchable.
Well, yeah, I mean, if it is 2 drones that had explosives heading for the Kremlin, it's difficult to see that as anything other than an attempt, at the very least, to cause significant damage to that, you know, very important building at the heart of the Russian government. But this war, you know, looking at these adapted doodlebugs has become, especially from the Ukrainian side, a war in which they have had to look to ingenuity and adaptation to try to do whatever they can with whatever equipment they have to hand, because yes, they're getting lots of supplies from NATO, but not nearly as much as they need to come up against a foe such as Russia and the might of the Russian military. So they've had to do things like this, use these drones, use these, flying pipe bombs.
It's interesting that NATO has reminded Kiev that or at least they have sent 98% of what was promised in terms of the armour and equipment. But we've still not had a Ukrainian spring attack. We were led to believe that maybe there'd be some sort of 12 units that would launch some kind of offensive going back across the border to push the Russians back from where they've actually invaded Ukrainian territory.
Yeah, I mean, certainly they were waiting for better weather with a view to the conditions being sort of more conducive to a push. But also the Ukrainians have been frustrated, to say the least, by the fact that, yes, they get equipment from NATO, but it's often in dribs and drabs and over a period of time. And they are still really waiting and training on these Western tanks that they're getting. They are being moved.
And the
some
leopards,
of them are in country, but they need the supply lines in place. They need all of their personnel properly equipped and trained to be able to use them, and all of the backup services that they require. So that may well be also a factor in the spring offensive as such, not pushing forward in any meaningful way. But to get back to this drone incident, it's serious if it does escalate, if the Russians are adamant that this was an attempt on Vladimir Putin, an attempt to cause significant damage to the Kremlin. Because you remember in the early days of the war, there was a push on Kyiv and a lot of aerial bombardment of Kyiv. That there's still installations, and occasionally, of course, they hit apartment blocks and civilian areas. But by and large, the operations to target Kyiv and government facilities in Kiev are not nearly as nearly as significant as they were in the early days. But if Russia decides to respond in kind, to retaliate for this, we could see an uptick in the types of munitions going over to actually the heart of government in Kyiv.
Yeah, and targeting the capitals either side. Mark, thank you for updating us on that. Of course, more as we get it. Just to say, those are claims coming in from Russian news agencies quoting the Kremlin, but we'll get more independent assessment of that coming up.